to our Population Mental Health Forum. Just a few notes. I'm Kirsten Conan. I'm professor of psychiatric epidemiology at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. And we will be having these forums monthly. Last spring and summer, they were focused on mental health in the time of COVID. But as I'm sure many of the audience knows, COVID has revealed what were persistent and longstanding disparities in mental health in different populations. And so many of our forum will be focused on health disparity populations. So just a few notes before we get started. This will be a presentation followed by a question and answer session. Please post your questions in the Q&A part of Zoom. We're going to use the chat feature to share links, but the chat feature won't let the audience chat with each other. So please use the Q&A tool to ask questions. And also this meeting will be recorded and will be shared on our website after we get it captioned and then we share it. And so with that, I'll hand it over to the person hosting today, Dr. Christina Court, who's an instructor in psychiatry at Massachusetts General Hospital and a research associate at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you, Kirsten. So I'm really pleased to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Karina Walters. So Karina Walters is a professor in the School of Social Work at the University of Washington. She's an enrolled member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, the Catherine Hall Chamber Scholar, and the director and principal investigator of the Indigenous Wellness Research Institute at the University of Washington, which is a center funded by the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities. Dr. Walters has over 25 years of experience in social epidemiological research on the historical, social, and cultural determinants of health among American Indian and Alaskan Native populations, as well as chronic disease preventative research and tribally based intervention research. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Walters.
Good morning, everybody. Halito sahachifat Karina Walters micha chata siya hoke micha. Really happy to be here. I just want to acknowledge the land that I'm in. I am right now in the land of the Snohomish and near the Duwamish people in Seattle, Washington. I'm going to actually, I've just chatted my folks here and I just need some help with opening up the screen share because now I'm seeing that my frame here does not show that option. I cannot go to a full Zoom to do that. So, oh, I am here. I got it now. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to open it up now to my screen and see. Is it screen sharing at the moment?
It is screen sharing. Yeah, perfect.
Got it.
Now it's awesome. Yay. I still have trouble with this.
This is the moment when everybody gets very nervous, right?
Yeah, exactly, right. No one wants to hear me talk for an hour. So thank you, Karina.
No problem. So this is a little bit about, I'm going to talk a little bit about historical trauma today, but before doing that, I always acknowledge my ancestors, and I'm enrolled in the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. And we descend from the Mississippian people, if you go back a couple thousand years, from around Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. And this is actually a screenshot of where my ancestors literally lived, out at Moundville in Alabama. And as you can see, we had quite elaborate living arrangements, and this is also Cahokia. We actually had cities. About 40 to 70,000 people lived in some of these areas with incredible trade. And I raise that because I'm actually from Hollywood, California, and I get to joke that I'm a real Hollywood Indian, but a lot of people assume that urban is a new experience for Native people. And the issue for us is that urban isn't new in terms of being in large cities and having that kind of different kinds of infrastructure. But it's new under the terms of settler colonialism. And that's where things get a little bit different. And that is directly connected to mental health. So I'll be highlighting a little bit about how historical trauma, settler colonialism impacts mental health for Indigenous populations. And again, this is where our sacred mound is in Mississippi, We have several origin stories. This is one of the places that we say we emerged from the earth. And again, these are some of my ancestors who I'm acknowledging today and I'm carrying with me as I'm sharing this talk. Okay, so I am going to talk a little bit about, I'm going to use the elements, water, land, air, and fire to break up my presentation into 4 sections. And so I'm going to talk, let's start with water. I would like you to think a little bit about when you take a sip of water today, about what that, where's water really coming from? What is it about? For Native people, water is life. Water is our first medicine. We are literally birthed from our mother's waters. Our body is mostly made up of water. Our earth is mostly made up of water. So water is literally life. And for us, it is literally medicine. But when you take that water, take a sip of water today, I want you to think about, where does it go? Water, it literally, it goes back up into the heavens, up into the atmosphere, forms clouds, comes back down as rain, and there's that continual cycle of regeneration up to the clouds and back down. And so when you think about that and you take that sip of water today, that water you are drinking today is literally the same water your ancestors at some point touched their lips to. And I think that's, in that way, I want you to think about how I'm going to talk about historical trauma. That the traumatic events that our ancestors may have experienced sometimes still recycles back, or we're still connected to in the present generation. It's literally sometimes taken up in our bodies, and sometimes in our, even manifests in how we think and feel about ourselves and expressed in our mental health. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that today. But I don't want you guys to think that I'm talking about us as victims. Because this, when I talk about historical trauma, it's not at all about victimhood. It's actually about power, love, and vision. And I want everyone to keep that in mind as well. And when I talk about power, what I mean is in that moment, in this very moment, if I take care of my health and well-being, if I take care of my mental health, I'm not only benefiting myself or my immediate family, but I'm benefiting future generations as well, right? My mental health actually has an impact on like the next 7 generations, we would say. But also in this moment, I have a great opportunity to work through and address the traumas or the experiences I still carry and embody that my ancestors didn't get an opportunity to address. So this moment isn't a moment of disempowerment. It's actually a moment of incredible power. So I want us to keep that in mind. So historical trauma is about power. It's also about love, because my ancestors, the Choctaw, this Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, that's my tribe. We're the people who originally, we're the survivors. Our family, our tribe are the people who survived the Trail of Tears. So I think, as my ancestors walked that Trail of Tears, they walked that trail with a vision of love and life for all of us, so that we would live well, so that we would live happily. And so they walked that trail with a vision of love. And our job in this generation is to reconnect to that vision of love and be able to carry that forward for the next 7 generations as well. It's also about vision. They had foresight and ability to envision a future for us. And it's our opportunity to reconnect to that future and regenerate it for future generations as well. So power, love, and vision. It's really about that. It's about love. It's not about focusing on the drama and the trauma so much, but we do have to acknowledge that. And as mental health experts and professionals, we recognize you can't just sidestep it, but you still have to address the trauma. So my career has been focused on asking this main question: how do traumatic events and stressors become literally taken up in our bodies, in our physical and mental health, as well as in our expressed through our risk behaviors? I've developed the Indigenous stress coping model to help think a little bit about it in terms of how we look at it, how the process works, how the mechanisms work, and also how we can research this. So I'll be talking a little bit about these historically traumatic events today briefly. And then I'm not going to talk about these types of everyday discriminatory events, because the historical trauma events and the everyday discrimination both interact and can potentially have an impact on our well-being. But what protects us? what makes, what buffers the impact of these kinds of historically traumatic events on our well-being? And that is culture, language, family, reconnecting and regenerating those processes. They literally can act as a shield to buffer the impact of those kinds of traumatic events on our well-being. And when I talk about well-being today, I don't mean just your mental health, because for us as Indigenous people, mental health is so intimately connected to all other parts of our being, our mind, our body, our spirit, our emotions. It's even connected to land and environment. I'm going to talk more about that in a little bit. So when I want you to think about mental health, I also want you to think about land. And all of this has an impact on our well-being, our bodies, and our minds. That's a little picture of my daughter. I always like to throw her in the presentations with us. And for those of you who, like me, also want to geek out on what it looks like more from a research standpoint, this is a little bit more about what the stress coping model would look like and what kinds of outcomes we're talking about potentially being impacted, including obesity-related health outcomes, substance abuse, mental health, especially PTSD, depression, anxiety. So the historical trauma, you know, and embodiment. I want to give a acknowledgement to Dr. Nancy Krieger. Her work really influenced me and really got me to think about this idea of embodiment, how social and historical inequities can become literally embodied. And as she talks about, bodies tell stories and histories, just as bones literally illuminate the important information about the everyday lives of our ancestors, whether or not these stories live in our consciousness, right? But critics have contended that historical trauma effects are negligible once lifetime rates of abuse are accounted for, right? And we also know that amassing evidence at the cellular level, that there are powerful stressful environmental conditions that can leave an imprint or a mark on our epigenome. And that can possibly be carried into future generations with devastating consequences. You know, there's some evidence in terms of thinking about the mental health link here. There's evidence that neurobiological toll of stress can be seen in descendant generations' health. So for example, maternal psychological and nutritional stress during pregnancy can lead to biological changes that predispose offspring to diabetes, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, and PTSD as adults. So studying embodiment of historical trauma and the corresponding health and mental health consequences allows us to actually determine the forces driving these intergenerational patterns of disease. Whoopsie. Okay, so I'm going to switch now to land. And the reason I'm going to talk, this section is entitled Land, is a little bit about epistemology here and how we understand what's happening historically and what we haven't been taught necessarily in our schools growing up. From a Native point of view, we say, I am the land is me. That's a common proverb among a number of our tribes expressed in different ways. And that's very different than the settler colonial thinking about land, which is I own the land and the land is mine. And that fundamental difference is where we have a real split between understanding health and wellness. So let me talk a little bit about settler colonialism, because we can't understand historically traumatic events until we understand the context in which those events take place. So settler colonialism is a distinct type of colonialism that functions through the replacement of indigenous populations with an invasive settler society that over time develops a distinctive identity and sovereignty. And Cox, that's a quote from Cox. It normalizes continuous settler occupation, exploits land and resources to which indigenous peoples have genealogical relationships. So settler colonialism, this is a key part. It's a structure, it's a system. It's a system that has particular policies and ways of thinking embedded in it. So it's a structure, it's not an actual event. And that's where it's very different than historical trauma, because historical trauma are the events that uphold settler colonialism. And when I'm talking about structures and policies, I'm talking about ones like doctrine of discovery, manifest destiny, and all of these are designed to create distortions in origin narratives, right? So as you displace indigenous people, you dispossess them of the land, and settlers occupy the land, there is a drive to replace that story and eliminate Native people and erase them from the landscape so that you can create an origin story that distorts historical realities and can free people from guilt and accountability, rationalize and normalize continuous settler occupation, and the rights to actually continue to dispossess Native people of their lands. So the things, and even not just from the lands, but even from the social discourse, right? So we don't even hear about the experiences of Native people. We're absent. Good example of this, the elimination process or the erasure. We're absent from most major national health data sets. And that's an example. We're just eliminated from the conversation, even though we have very high levels of health inequities and disparities. So Eve Tuck summarizes this beautifully. She says, everything, the impact is everything within a settler colonial society strains to destroy or assimilate the native in order to disappear them from the land. And this is how a society can have multiple simultaneous and conflicting messages about Indigenous people, such as all Indians are dead, located in faraway reservations, and that contemporary Indigenous people are less Indigenous than prior generations, and that all Americans are a little bit Indian. So example of that, just to highlight it a little bit, where did this thinking kind of originate? And we can go back further than this, but the impact on the American colonies and over time, and it can be seen with the doctrine of discovery. That was a papal, the papal bull in 1493. They decreed that any land inhabited by people who are not Christians can be discovered and then claimed by Christian rulers who have the authority to overthrow barbarous nations and have the right to enslave them and force adoption of Christianity. Now, why does this matter? Because our own policies and laws, so this is the structural element, have referenced this as a justifiable policy or approach or way of thinking. In 1823, the doctrine of discovery became part of the US federal law in Johnson versus McIntosh and was used to dispossess Native people of their land. In that unanimous decision, Chief Justice John Marshall wrote that the principle of discovery gave European nations an absolute right to New World lands. And what that did is that led to the right and the authority from the American standpoint to dispossess us further and remove us through the Trail of Tears and Indian removal processes. So that's an example of how it gets played out systemically. But how does it also get played out in us not really knowing the stories? And I'll give you a brief example of that. In my own tribe, when the anthropologists have written about when the Spanish conquistadors first came, because that was our first contact, was De Soto. I've seen anthropologists write that we actually experienced De Soto as probably as a great god, because there had been some prophecy, or there was a spirit called Okanaholo, and this because he had this great reverence for this great spirit, that when the Spaniards showed up, we somehow equated that great spirit with the Spaniards. And why is that even told as part of the narrative? And except to justify the potential continuation of taking the land. But let me just tell you what Okanaholo really is. So they may have heard that word and they've assumed that that's what that means. But Okanaholo is the word it is used. That's what it is used for when the Spaniards arrived. So Okanaholo really it's actually a serpent that lives in whirlpools and the waters, a spirit that's very evil and dark. And what it does is it calls you to the water and asks you to look in and admire yourself. And as you're admiring yourself and you're reflecting on yourself, you get wrapped up in yourself, that spirit then jumps out and grabs you and brings you right back into the water and transforms you into one of them. Now that's a very different understanding of Okanaholo than what is written down in the books. So what is told quite often is a different narrative that serves the purpose of continued settler colonial processes and structures, but quite often isn't the reality. So I thought I'd share that with you. So let's talk a little bit about how does historically traumatic events then line up with settler colonialism, and how does that have an impact on our well-being? Historical trauma, these are considered events. It's different than intergenerational trauma, right? You could have had a great famine in one generation, and you could still see the impact in future generations potentially. And it was a great cataclysmic event. So, there was great upheaval and great trauma for the people. What's different about historical trauma is conceptualized as a human-made event that's perpetrated on a group of people who share a particular group identity. And it's designed to do three main things. It's designed to eradicate a people, could be tribe, community, families, and quite often it's genocidal in intent. It's also designed to eradicate lifeways, our culture, language, identity, or religion, and that's also a form of ethnocide, which is also a form of genocide. And it's designed to eradicate thoughtways, worldviews, knowledges, and epistemologies, how we think and talk about ourselves, epistemicide, right? So, and the trauma is often conceptualized and experienced as collective, and it significantly impacts community. But I want to acknowledge that just because people have had historically traumatic events, it doesn't mean everyone has poor mental health, right? People thrive and still survive despite these major events. So I want to acknowledge that as well. People are incredibly resilient, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So some examples of historically traumatic events, and these are some based from our knowledge, right? One is that most people don't know that there was a very large American Indian slave trade, and actually throughout the Americas. My tribe, for example, was shipped to, a lot of us were shipped to Cuba and to Haiti. Some of the research now is starting to tell that story. So if we were to add up all the Indian slaves taken in the New World from the time of Columbus to the end of the 19th century, the figure would run somewhere between 2.5 and 5 million native slaves. Another example of some of the genocidal aspects of this. And again, when you think about settler colonialism, I want you to remember it's always about land, and it's always about erasure. Those two things are always tied together. So whenever there was westward expansion, a drive for more land, quite often whenever there was gold discovered or other kind of valuable property or minerals, that's when you would see these genocidal policies really come forward. A good example is one that persisted for a very long time, was scalp hunting. It was sanctioned in the colonies, and it was actually memorialized by one of the first statues of women in America was a woman named Hannah Duston, and a story about her scalping Native people. And she was memorialized. That's our first woman that's memorialized in a statue in the United States of America. But through the 1850s and 90s, there was a scalp bounty extermination laws that were created to create a class. It basically created a class of Indian hunters, and through the 1860s and 1900s, the American Army Medical Museum called for Indian heads and other remains to be able to be collected. So scalping parties went out and actually did that, as well as collecting our body parts from burial grounds and battlefields, hospitals, and fresh graves, and so forth. That was actually a practice. And you can see from this is why, this is the reason why when you hear Native people say, when we see the term Washington Redskins, because a lot of these scalps were referred to as Redskins, that makes people upset in contemporary times, right? Again, once gold was found, we'd saw massive removal onto reservation and turned on reservations. So the reservation processes was also part of that historical trauma. I'm going to go a little bit more quickly because I want to get to the trauma that I think is still persistent. You can still really feel in the present time, which has to do with the boarding school. And 1880s were a very critical period to understand historical trauma in relation to mental health. And the reason was, in 1880s, what happened was there started to be slightly a move away from outright killing Native people to trying to rapidly assimilate if that was possible. But to do that, there's some laws that started to shift, and people began to be almost human. And so when we became almost human, a couple of things could happen. One is we could be educated, That meant we had a potential for education, but it also meant we had potential to have mental illness because of our intellectual capabilities. It was very interesting. So those two things started coming around right about that time. So, so in the 1880s, well up into the 1970s, these persisted, but the height of this period of Indian boarding schools happened, where basically it was under the Secretary of War, and they took Native children and they transferred them into boarding schools. If you didn't cooperate, and quite often kids were kidnapped, and hundreds of thousands of our children ended up being put into these boarding schools, on average put away for 7 years in these boarding schools, forced to learn and replace their Christian, their cultural practices with Christian practices. And the idea was to kill the Indian to save the man. And unfortunately, a lot of these boarding schools, children were physically and sexually abused. And you can see how young children were. So these kids, if you see these children here at Carlisle Indian School, they were raised and parented by a system, and a militaristic system. They were not raised and parented by affection, healthy attachments, families that could teach them about traditional forms of addressing wrongs when someone does something incorrectly, and things like that. But rather, they were taught through quite a lot of violence. And here's an example of Tom Torino, who's a young Navajo man when he first arrived, and this is him 3 years later. It also impacted how we viewed sex and gender relationships. Patriarchy was kind of enforced, so a lot of matrilineal, matriarchal cultures trying to basically kill women, kill women's roles, so that the patriarchy could be assumed as well in our households. And then turning to the mental health aspects of this, and as I said, you could be educatable. There's another law that was put in place during that period in the 1880s through the 1890s, which was the Court of Indian Offenses. So if you're found practicing your culture, your religion, you could be imprisoned or your rations would be withheld. And during that period, because people were trying to do a more westward expansion and get into settlements, there began to be an idea that perhaps some of these people might be mentally unwell. And the Canton, South Dakota Chamber of Commerce advocated for creating the first Indigenous, and they called it the Indian Insane Asylum, called Hiawatha. And they acknowledged, even in those documents, that one of the reasons to do this was because these wild Indians were making it difficult for settlement in their area. It was absolutely horrible conditions. They used to keep people chained up, and we really wasn't real medical treatment or care there. Most of the people absolutely, it was shown later through some of the research and documents in 1933 when they decided to close it down because of the abusive conditions, that the majority of people who were there because they were political agitators or spiritual or medicine people, not because they actually had true mental health issues. At least 141 people died there. During that period, they used to hold summer sessions where people could come in and see, pay a price and visit and see the crazy Indians like it was a zoo. Okay, despite all of that, we're still here, and we actually do pretty darn well considering that. But nevertheless, these kinds of events, they tend to be chronic, and they, as you can see from kind of a historical timeline perspective, they're not one-offs, they're not one-time events. They're events that are layered because these events are designed to uphold a settler colonial process and system. But what is the impact of historical trauma on our mental health and our well-being? There's a couple of points I want you to think about with that. Is historically traumatic events and settler colonialism are both designed to disrupt our ability to fulfill our original instructions. So think about it this way. When General Sheridan said the best way to kill the Lakota was to kill the buffalo, he wasn't talking about cutting off just their food supply. He was talking about cutting off their ability to fulfill their original teachings that their ancestors had taught them. It was actually a deep spiritual assault, just as much as it was a cutoff of the need for food. The second element, historically traumatic events or historical trauma and settler colonialism, they also are designed to disrupt our relational ways of being. When those children were in boarding school, it disrupted their relational way of being to their land, to their culture, to their language, because they were forbidden, they were not allowed to speak their language. So it's a disruption of relational ways of being. And it causes a disruption in our spatial obligations and relationships, because if you don't have those stories to understand what the teachings are, then that's disrupted. It also disrupts the way we think and talk about ourselves as Native people, right? So to address those things, to really begin to think about mental health interventions and health interventions for Native communities, then those three elements have to be part of that. One is we need to bring back and regenerate our original teachings, focus on growing interventions from our original instructions, growing relational restorative practices. So relational restoration is critical, and narrative transformation. And I'll give you a good example of that. If a Native person has been a client in mental health system for a really long time, and Eduardo Duran talks a little bit about this story, and Elements shared this story with me, so I'm going to share some of it with you. When a Native person has been in a system for a really long time, one thing that I just want to point out is colonization, settler colonialism requires dependency, right? It creates systems of dependency on the nation state. And even we can see that at the mental health level. So people who've been in the system a really long time, usually with a Native client, the Native, a more decolonizing approach would be something like this. They would say, well, tell me a little bit about yourself. Tell me who are you? And tell me about yourself. And the person would quite often say, let's say the client would say, oh yeah, well, I'm depressed, right? So a person who's been socialized in the system for a long time sometimes starts to identify as their disease, right? And so using a little Native humor, quite often we would say something like, oh, okay, so tell me about that naming ceremony. How did you receive this very sacred name, depressed? And then, so a little humor thrown in there to kind of offset it, but at the same time, we're starting that narrative transformation process here, thinking about it a little differently. And then the client would be like, well, no, wait a minute. What are you talking about? My name's not depressed. That's kind of crazy. My name's, John. No, okay, well, I'll call you John, but you also told me your name's depressed. So, tell me about the ceremony, how you received this name. So now we're talking about a name that is outside of yourself, but you've received it. And why is that important? From a cultural perspective, when you receive a name helps you understand how to walk in the world. It helps you understand how the community is to respond to you. It actually tells you what your responsibilities of conduct in the world are. So when you receive, so when this Native person, the therapist says, tell me about this sacred ceremony, and by then the client's scratching his head, going, I don't know what you're talking about. And he said, well, when the doctors and social workers and all these very gather for a sacred council, and they may gather in a long room with a big long table, and they have this big sacred ceremony, and they open up their sacred text, DSM. They open up that DSM, and they open it up, and they open up, and they all agree. They agree on your name, that your name is now to be depressed. And then by then, usually the client's laughing, going, no. Okay, I see what you're saying. So now we're starting a relational relationship to what this depression is. And we say, okay, so tell me when this depression visits you. So now it's outside of you. It's something you can look at. You're not your disease, but you have a relational experience of what that means to be diseased, out of balance, out of ease. And you say, well, tell me a little bit about when this visits you. Does it wake you up in the middle of the night? Does it disturb you in the morning, early morning hours? So if you have a relationship with depression, what happens is now you can put some boundaries around it, right? You can tell it when to visit, when not to visit. You can start to have that kind of relationship with it. So that's just an example of how some of the relational and narrative transformation strategies are done more on a clinical level for our Native communities. But now I'm going to talk a little bit on the research level about historically traumatic events and its impact. In a study that we did called the Honor Project, it was an NIMH funded RO1, we were interested in looking at the intergenerational impact of historically traumatic events. Now, of course, this is very difficult because we had to use a cross-sectional design, right? We didn't have a real-time historical trauma event, and then we can't follow people in that way. But we were able to ask people if they experienced this, if their parents experienced these events, if their grandparents, and we went all the way back 3 generations. And we recognize there's problems in recall with that, but we anticipated that most likely the recall would be that we didn't have enough people recalling. That people wouldn't have the knowledge of the events. So it would be usually an undercount of these kind of events. But what we found initially in our initial regressions was that there was some relationship between different types of historically traumatic events that people experienced and mental health outcomes, PTSD, anxiety, and depression, where we saw events that were targeted to a particular community seem to be more connected, high impact events connected to contemporary PTSD, whereas kind of more chronic events were connected potentially to depression. So we looked further. So basically we're then wondering, well, let's look at this a little bit more closely and do a longitudinal analysis to see if we can evaluate the association of the pattern of trauma exposure for the 4 preceding generations and its impact on present day. And now, why is this important? Because critics say, well, maybe it's the traumatic events that you currently have lived in your lifetime that's going to really trump any historically trauma events that happened to your ancestors' generations. And that's a reasonable empirical question. But I don't think it's the right question. I actually think that maybe both could be true. And part of that on a more clinical level is to figure out how do these two potentially interact to produce mental health that we're seeing today. So what we did was we looked, and what we found after controlling, so what we did is we isolated, we wanted a control for some of those other kind of traumatic events that would be predictive in someone's lifetime for PTSD or depression, right? So, or substance use. So we controlled for lifetime physical abuse, sexual abuse, military service, even their own historically traumatic events that they experienced in their own generation. And so those were used as covariates to control for the effect of lifetime trauma on retrospective reporting of trauma from past generations. And what we found was interesting, that overall trauma across multiple generations was associated with elevated PTSD, and that direct attacks across multiple generations was also associated with PTSD, as well as substance use, alcohol use, greater alcohol problems in the last year. And interestingly, the land-based events, the attack on the land, remember I said I am the land is me, land-based events over many generations. So the chronicity of those events accounted for another 6% of variance in mental health outcomes. So something is going on here that is still persisting. And this just give you an example of some of the depression symptoms that we started to see. It was right at the P level 05, so we're not considering that really, we're not excited that that's a strong result, but that just gives you an idea of how we're looking at the chronicity. So to close this part, and then I'm going to just highlight a current project I'm working on right now to see where this shifted. So settler colonialism is the system. The HT events perpetuate and support the system. I'm going to move on to the wind and transformation part of the study. So one of the things that, okay, so we documented historical trauma has an impact on mental health. What do we do with it? How do we really transform this? And I gave you an example of the decolonizing practices at the clinical level, but at a population health level, how do we begin to look at this? How can we really impact community level health? And it was a Hawaiian elder who shared a story that really kind of made me think about things a little bit differently. And he talked about crabs in the bucket. And I don't know if you're familiar with that, but that's fishermen put crabs in a bucket. When they catch crabs, they put them in a bucket. And when one crab tries to crawl out of the bucket, all the other crabs pull that crab back down. Quite often, it's used as a metaphor for lateral violence or lateral discrimination in our communities. Someone's trying to get to the top and others pull them back down. And so he asked a very basic question, because there's an assumption that this is crab behavior, right? And me, if as a social worker, if I was a crab in that bucket, if I was a crab, I would be in there with the other crabs. I'd be like, come on, people, we can lift each other up. You know, we don't have to keep bringing each other down. Let's organize. Let's do something together. This is my population community organizing approach to addressing this syndrome. But this Hawaiian elder said something important. He said, do crabs live in a bucket? No, crabs don't live in a bucket. So he said, well, why did we accept the bucket as defining crab behavior? What do crabs look like and behave like when they're in their natural, healthful environment? This is why environments are so important, right? Well, what do crabs naturally do? He pointed out, he said, crabs actually lift each other up on the rocks in the natural environment when they're having difficulty. That's natural crab behavior. And okay, yeah, sure, there's probably one or two bad crabs that'll knock other crabs off, but generally that's crabs behavior. And I think that really shifted something in me because I realized, when did I accept the bucket? When did I accept historical trauma? When did I accept settler colonialism as potentially defining or limiting the vision of what health and wellness means or could be? Again, it's really basic. It goes back to, how do we create healthier environments, healthier systems, so these healthful behaviors can actually emerge? So basically, it blew my bucket away. And so I'm hoping that we can begin to think about how might we have accepted these buckets, even in our practices and our research paradigm. So basically, Albert Einstein said, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. And so that means we have to have that kind of a paradigm shift for approaching our work. And I don't have time to talk about this, but really, when I talk about the decolonizing approach to this, I'm not talking about it as a metaphor, but I'm actually talking about approaches that really aim to recognize and include Indigenous epistemologies and ontologies within a Western research paradigm. And I'll talk a little bit, I don't have time to talk all about that, but the key thing I want you to take away from this is that basically, as scientists, we cannot simply take Western structures of knowledge and add Indigenous and stir, and then create a perfectly native flavored synthesis of the two ways of knowing, right? I call it a tagging a feather approach in our intervention designs, even for large scale community-based prevention. But rather, we have to center interventions from the ground up, literally derived from the ground, and then pull in Western knowledge and Western approaches that can complement, so that these two can walk together and walk the path together for our health and well-being. So this is why we need to have these things come together. And in a project that I was asked, and I'm just going to highlight this in my final section on fire, I had this opportunity to do this with my own tribe. I was asked to consider, how can we address obesity prevention in our Native community at Choctaw Nation. And I was really honored to be asked to be part of that. Dr. Michelle Johnson Jennings, I was able to pull in for that. And I got to work with our elder, Sharon Fleming, who was a visionary leader in our community, and also the chief sister. And but Mickey Piercy at the time asked me, he said, you know, 1 out of 3 of our children are going to die, are going to have actually a childhood obesity by 2050. And he said, we're looking at a train that's already left the station, and parents and grandparents are going to outlive their children. And that is an unconscionable situation. So we said, well, what can we do? And he said, well, I want you to figure out, you know, can you come up with a program or an intervention that really kind of grows from our teachings? We want you to do something about that. And so answer came very simply to me, which was, you know, our ancestors didn't walk that trail of tears for us to be dying like we're dying. That we actually have to reconnect to that love and that vision of life that they carried for us, and that we can carry into the next generations. And so we basically set forward a plan, and we came back and we said, well, this is what we'd like to do. We'd like to develop, because we looked at all of what the tribe was doing. The tribe was doing really great work, doing all the Western approaches beautifully, literally great biological, behavioral interventions, surgical interventions, all the way up to structural interventions, putting in new pathways, changing diets, menus at tribal level, doing everything right, but seeing very little change and benefit. It was a slow trickle when we needed the water really coming through to clean. And so we came back and we said, well, what we're proposing is we want to create a Choctaw-specific health promotion model, but we need to create one. And the way we're going to create it is by rewalking the Trail of Tears. And each day we're going to ask ourselves, what are our original instructions around these things? And he got excited. He said, well, okay, let's do that. And he said, we'll help you with that, but take kids with you, and then you can do substance abuse prevention. And then you can do, other kinds of things like, suicide prevention as you're doing that work. And I said, well, wait a minute, that's what we want to do, is we want to flip the script. We really want to do a health promotion approach. We really want to change how we think about this, because we're so geared towards services and doing something in a service mindset, that we need to create a program that is sustainable and that our communities see themselves in, and it's driven by our cultural responsibilities and our connectedness to that. I said, so we have to flip the script. It's not about suicide prevention. It's about what are our original instructions about living healthfully and in balance. And when we get out of balance, how do we correct that? How do we right that? What are our original teachings for the value of life and living? It's not about substance abuse prevention. It's about what are our original teachings about medicines? And if we get out of balance with these medicines, how do we right ourselves? We had to decolonize ourselves even in talking about how we would approach this. And we got permission, that's what we did. We actually walked the Trail of Tears twice. A group of us did a qualitative research along the way. And because I'm running out of time, one of the things that we were really clear on is we wanted this to be a land-based intervention. And we know, because land-based interventions helps with our brain chemistry, opens up our cognitive processes in ways that we don't always get in a building setting. And we wanted to create this unique, culturally specific model. A little bit, this is where my tribe is in Oklahoma. See what the land is. You can see this is where we are located. And we still use traditional names for our areas, even associated with our clans and chiefs. So I'll give you an idea. We're bigger than the state of Massachusetts, by the way. Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. A lot of people don't realize that. That's the size of our now it's considered a reservation. So we were focused on how do we build original instructions in this relational restoration and transformation. And we're going to do it through land-based healing, to really rewalk the land, to answer the question, what is the Choctaw Road to Health? We created digital stories. We created a curriculum. We went out. I participated as both researcher and participant, which was another kind of approach to this qualitatively. We had 13 Choctaw walkers, 5 other Native walkers who were allies to also document the experience. We wanted that lens on the experience as well, and 3 non-Native allies. And we basically rewalked the trail 8 to 10 miles a day, so that's the same amount our ancestors would have walked. And we camped out on the land in areas that we know that our clans actually camped out on. Again, it wasn't to recreate the experience of the trauma, but it was reconnect to that vision of love and life. We triangulated everything: dreams, archival research, oral history, talked to elders, went to the Smithsonian. So it was a lot of early work to understand what were the values and that we wanted to have in our project. What was the thinking of our leaders during that time, if any of that was documented. So we wanted to see what people held for us. We did ceremony in preparing for that. You don't usually hear about that for research projects, but that was part of us cleaning ourselves so that we could be open to whatever we would receive on that trail. And here's just some of the highlighted pictures from walking that trail. We had parent-child pairs initially for that trail. And you could see it was a lot of walking, got a lot of bug bites. One of the things that we got from this, though, is the importance of experiential knowledge and being on the trail. And the data that we collected, even from that trail, there were, kinds of transforming themes around relational healing, reconnecting to our ancestors, We have some quotes. We do talk about it. It's like the ancestors are still here with us. Laughter is medicine. It was really powerful because when you're there, you can't stay in that trauma for long. And you started to realize that our ancestors lived and loved. They didn't just live in the trauma 24/7, even though they were physically maybe experiencing it. And that's when I realized my great-grandmother was born at Fort Castle right after they were removed there, which suggests they made love on the trail. So they made life on the trail. And so it made us shift some of our thinking. So that trauma isn't so centered, but the love started to really come through. And so we realized that when this is a quote from one of the participants, when you continue to center the trauma, then you continue to center the colonizer and the colonizing process. We created our own, this became our model, basically. And we, from this 2 pilot studies we did, we came back and we realized that we wanted to work with our ancient clan systems and what some of their roles were, and that would translate into everyday actions for behavioral change at the individual level, but that we wanted to create community-based health leaders. And so we incorporated elements of community organizing so that people can become prevention specialists in their community from a cultural perspective. So for example, if there was an overdose in our community, the Watan, like the white crane people, would normally be responsible for that. So all the white crane women who would be part of that health society would call other white crane women from the other parts of the communities to come and help with the prevention event, so and address that. We did integrate the IMB model into our work to help get this funded, but also to help understand some of the mechanisms for change, for motivation for change, rooted in our Indigenous understandings. And we ended up creating a 5-region longitudinal study that was funded by NIDA. We're still collecting data right now. It's a cluster randomized stepped wedge design. And now we have 150 Choctaw women from each of the tribal districts who are participating in this and becoming community health leaders at the community level. We're in our last year of that. Our guiding questions are, what kind of ancestor did my ancestors envision me to be? What kind of ancestor do I want to be? What kind of ancestor do I want or envision future generations to be? And here we've already, we can't show faces, but you can see us walking parts of the trail. It's had a tremendous impact. And just here's some quotes from some of the qualitative part of the study so far. One of the participants says, "I'm thankful to have a greater purpose. It gave me even more of a greater purpose to realize, hey, my ancestors came here. They didn't have diabetes. They didn't have all these health conditions. That is not something that we just are destined to have. That's something that can be changed." And then Ohoyo Annalie says, "With me, it did help me to get a better perspective, to eat healthier, to focus on healthier living lifestyle. I've gotten involved with the bike team. I've gotten involved in different fitness challenges, but this isn't just for myself, but for my family. My family is my #1 priority. If I don't take care of myself, then I don't show them how they should take care of themselves. Then that was the main thing to help me find a sense of myself." So I'm going to end there and turn to our remaining time for questions.
Wow, Karina, that was, I wish we had like a few more hours to spend with you on this, because I have about 1 million questions myself. So
I know I talked fast.
No, but it's actually really mind-blowing for someone who studies, my work focuses on trauma and broadly, and also involved in treating people with trauma, like I actually found it, like, some of the things you said are actually like hugely challenging to my own paradigms about Native peoples, but also generally about trauma. Yeah. So anyway, yeah, I mean, it's actually pretty mind-blowing, the whole, and I'll have Christina, there's a question by Nancy Krieger that I want to put up there, but this whole, what you said in the beginning about, I am depressed. Well, who gave you that name? That is still blowing my mind right now. So I'm just like, wow, I had never thought of that. Like, what that means to say I am. Yeah, anyway, it's just, so Nancy Krieger has a question. Karina, thanks for a superb presentation. Two questions. In your research, have you found it helpful to do analyses structured by birth cohort and place of birth as tied to the different histories that you importantly name? And she found that helpful in her research on the impact of Jim Crow and contemporary health. And then secondly, have you developed or are aware of good measures that capture not only people's understanding of these, so relevant histories, but also visions for the future?
Yeah.
There's a longer, so she, I don't know if you can
Yeah,
see,
great questions. Thanks,
yes,
Nancy,
of course,
for your
Nancy.
questions, as always. I love this idea, and I have not done it yet, to structure by birth cohort and place of birth. We have some data that we could probably go back and do that a little bit, but we have not done that yet. Although I do think that that would potentially have a serious impact. So that's exciting. I will follow up with you on that. Good measures. Yes, we do have some, we have some preliminary measures. I mean, the early work was just even trying to document what is a historically traumatic event that anyone can, we are so diverse. We have over 574 tribes in this country, right? So trying to get people to be able to plug into a construct that we can all agree to, right? So removal from traditional homelands is a construct we can agree to, but what that looks like for different tribes is very different, right? So it took a while just to even kind of develop a historical trauma index type of thing for that part of it. We do have a microaggression measure as well that we've developed. We have since moved into developing, and this is based on some of the work coming out of Alaska, working with Alaska Natives, Gerald Mohat's group and others, Stacy Rasmus and Jim Allen. They've done a beautiful job working very closely with Yupik elders there, really translating some of these culturally based constructs of even how you think about a structure of a home and how that connects to well-being, but the construct of community connectedness and belonging. The one thing I would say that is the biggest predictor, everyone does identity research. I used to do identity research, I still do, but it's the sense of belonging and connectedness that really matters. Do you belong to your family? Do you belong to your community? But also, do you belong to your ancestors? And they belong to you. And that sense of belonging and connectedness is really critical. And we're starting to develop some measures there. Now on the structural and epistemological harms of settler colonialism, no, I haven't, but boy, I'm kind of excited about the work that I'm starting to do and hopefully writing a book for, on looking at this interaction of settler colonialism and historical trauma more closely, and understanding the mechanisms and the structures and that drive this relationship that it has an impact on our health and well-being. So thanks for that question. I will follow up with you, Nancy.
Yeah, and Nancy says if people didn't see the Q&A, part of what is so critical to what you say is the omnipresence of history, and if we live decontextualized lives, well, no wonder what our health would be terrible. So now my fantasy is having you and Nancy, Karina and Nancy panel, because then we can have our mind blown. I want to try to throw out one more question before we have to go. She also, so one of the audience, I'm glad to see you delivering this from a public health perspective and conducting rigorous research on this question. Where do you see your work within the global mental health? Where do you see your work in the global mental health framework?
Oh my goodness.
That's a big question too.
Yeah, no, it's first of all, it's definitely global mental health framework. Indigenous populations around the world deal with settler colonialism, and I worked very closely. I did a Fulbright over in New Zealand, working with collaborating with Maori communities there, who epistemologically are well ahead of what we were doing in terms of integrating into our actual research here. I think we've come a long ways in integrating better our Indigenous epistemologies and the work we do in the decolonizing practices now. But I do need to give a shout out to Dr. Linda Tuhiwai-Smith and a whole bunch of folks there, Dr. Leonie Pihama and others who have really centered Indigenous knowledges there and Kapapa Māori, and really call to action for global Indigenous health to do the same, right? That we need to center our Indigenous knowledges as the place from which we work and the place from which we dream. And I think, so yeah, Canada, New Zealand, anywhere where the British Empire has been, but it's different, you know, some things are similar, but some things are different in terms of settler colonial processes. United States just has a love of totally distancing itself from a really horrible origin, right? And so until we can reconcile with that, it's really hard to progress on healing. But I have hope. I think we can. I think we can do it in a way that's not about pointing fingers but really about how do we ease our suffering and how do we address health inequities? How do we move forward? Because my health is tied to your health and your health is tied to my health. And if we don't work together and make this happen, then all of us are suffering. And then we tie it to our land, right? So the global health piece, that's my last point on this. If we look at climate change and climate migration and climate impacts, that's huge because that's going to directly impact mental health and well-being. And again, I am the land is me. Indigenous people are going to be the first impacted by this in ways than we already are. So that on the global stage, we all need to work together to address that.
Well, that is, I have like a million more questions, but I guess we'll end it here. Thank you everyone for attending. Our next forum will be on LGBT-Q disparities in mental health. I'm sort of inspired by this. It's given me ideas. So maybe we can bring Karina back in the spring. If we're still assuming we're still Zooming, one of the benefits. So thank you. Hopefully not. Hopefully not. But thank you so much. Probably will be. Thank you so much, Karina. That was fabulous. And thank you for everyone who attended. And we will be posting this. Thank you. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much for taking the time. Bye-bye.
My pleasure.